By the year 1700, London was already a growing city of smoke, ships, and ambition. But over the next 2 centuries, it would transform into the capital of a global empire. A city where decisions made in quiet offices and crowded docks shaped the fate of lands thousands of miles away. Ships carried goods, ideas, laws, people, and power. Everything began in London, and everything returned to London. This is the story of London and the colonies. How they became connected. How they changed each other. And how their relationship shaped the world we know today. Hello and welcome. I hope your day is going well, and thank you for joining me on this journey through time. Today, we explore how London rose from a European port city to the command center of a global empire. How decisions made beside the River Thames influenced millions of lives across continents. The colonies supplied resources, soldiers, taxes, and trade. London controlled policy, finance, law, and the machinery of empire. Together, they built a system that changed history. Before we begin, here is something to think about. Did the colonies shape Londona's rise, or did London shape the destiny of the colonies more? London before Empire 1600 to 1700. The sound of wheels and hooves competes with the calls of traders and the clatter of workshops. The air smells of river water, market food, and the fuel burned to keep homes warm. It is a place of everyday life, not yet the global capital it will one day become. The River Thames runs through the heart of it, a highway before the age of highways. Every morning and evening, it fills with barges, ferries, fishing boats, and merchant ships. Sailors from distant places walk its banks. Lockkeepers and dockworkers signal to vessels from the shore. The river is both frontier and lifeline. It carries London's ambitions outward and brings foreign goods inward. People stand along the water and watch masts rise above the fog, wondering where those ships have been and where they will go next. The Royal Exchange becomes the center of commercial conversation. Merchants gather beneath its arches to talk about markets, weather, and cargo. They negotiate quietly, moving coins and contracts with careful intent. These meetings are not yet the empire's heartbeat, but they form its earliest pulse. News from faraway coasts arrives here first. Rumors of opportunity travel faster than the ships themselves. London is not yet a hub of empire, but the pieces are beginning to align. In 1600, the East India Company is founded. Its charter marks the beginning of a new chapter, though few at the time understand what it will become. The company receives permission to send ships eastward in search of spices, silks, and trade partnerships. It starts as a commercial venture, not an empire. But trade brings influence, and influence seeks protection, and protection requires fleets, diplomacy, and authority. A path is being built step by step, even if the travelers cannot yet see the destination. Around the docks, shipyards echo with the sound of axes and saws. Rope makers twist hemp into miles of line that will hold sails across the world's winds. Sails are stitched by hand in long sheds that smell of pitch and canvas. Every finished ship is a gamble. It may return with fortune. It may never return at all. The people who work on these vessels do not speak of empire. They speak of wages, storms, and the weight of barrels they will load on deck. London's streets reflect this uncertain balance between old and new. Markets sell simple goods, from bread and fish to firewood and cloth. Taverns buzz with talk of voyages and politics. Churches mark the rhythm of the week. Yet change is always present in quiet ways. Imported spices appear in wealthy households. Foreign fabrics decorate the rooms of aristocrats. New maps hang in offices where merchants trace routes and mark promising coasts with ink. The city itself is vulnerable. Fires break out among the wooden houses. Disease moves through crowded alleys. The Great Plague strikes in the 1660s and empties neighborhoods with terrifying speed. In 1666, the Great Fire tears through the city, destroying thousands of homes and landmarks. The destruction is immense. The skyline collapses. But the rebuilding becomes an act of transformation. Stone replaces timber. Streets widen. New designs emerge. The city does not return to what it was. It changes, and in changing, it prepares for what it will become. Trade continues even in hardship. Ships still leave the Thames with cargo and paperwork. The Royal Navy begins to expand its presence, protecting merchants and routes. Politics evolves to support a wider horizon. Decisions made in Parliament ripple outward to lands that London has not yet seen. Commerce pushes the city forward more than conquest does. Profit becomes a navigator. The pursuit of opportunity draws maps across oceans. Through the decade after the fire, London's rebuilt forms signal resilience. Stone buildings replace charred wood. New districts rise. Bridges strengthen. Docks improve. Ships bring back news, materials, and ideas. London becomes a crossroads where cultures intersect without any grand plan. The transformation begins not with intent, but with momentum. The 17th century closes with quiet certainty that Londona's identity is shifting. It is still a place of muddy streets and crowded markets. But it also holds within it the first outlines of a capital that will one day command global attention. The East India Company grows. New trading networks take hold. Investors, sailors, laborers, merchants, and craftsmen form the human pillars of a system that is still in its earliest form. No one in the streets believes they are standing at the beginning of an empire. They see only their own work, their own boats, their own shops, their own families. Yet history moves beneath their feet. Every contract signed at the Royal Exchange, every ship that leaves the Thames. Every warehouse built along the docks becomes a brick in a structure that will one day reshape the world. London before empire is not a story of grandeur. It is a story of transition. It is a story of a city learning to look outward. It is a story of riverbanks that connect to oceans, of businesses that connect to continents, and of decisions that connect to consequences that will echo for centuries. No one knew that this beginning would reshape the world. In the early 18th century, the Atlantic Ocean became more than a body of water. It became a corridor of movement, profit, and ambition. Between 1700 and 1760, the shape of world commerce changed. And London found itself rising as the center of this new system. Ships sailed from the Thames toward the Caribbean and North America, returning with goods that would reshape Britannia's economy. Sugar, rum, and tobacco arrived in warehouses near the docks. Manufactured goods left in exchange, feeding a loop of trade that reached across oceans and back again. The Atlantic world was emerging, and London stood at its center. The change did not happen overnight. At the start of the century, London was a commercial city with regional influence. By mid-century, it had become a hub that connected continents. Merchant houses grew larger. Shipping firms learned how to manage long voyages. Banks developed tools to finance ventures that crossed seas. Insurance companies calculated risks and made it possible for ships to travel with financial safety. The city began to think in global terms. Trade was no longer a matter of local supply. It was a system that required planning, organization, and coordination across thousands of miles. Sugar from the Caribbean became one of the pillars of this system. It arrived in crates and barrels, destined for refineries and markets across Britain. It was a product that changed diets and habits, a commodity that turned into profit as soon as it reached the docks. Rum followed it, moving through taverns, ports, and export routes. Tobacco from North America became another major link in the chain. It passed through customs houses, auction rooms, and counting houses, where clerks recorded shipments and calculated returns. Every crate carried profit, every shipment connected someone in London to someone across the sea. Manufactured goods traveled in the opposite direction. British textiles, tools, metalwork, and household items left for the Atlantic markets. These goods filled the holds of ships that would return with resources unavailable in Europe. The exchange supported factories, workshops, and the workers who operated them. Cities grew as trade became a central part of daily life. London's prosperity did not come from a single product, but from the circulation of goods, credit, and information. Coffee houses in the city became centers of activity. Merchants gathered to share news from overseas. Captains reported conditions at distant ports. Prices and rumors traveled from table to table. In these crowded rooms, fortunes could be made by those who understood the flow of the market. It was here that London began to realize something new. The world could be influenced without ever leaving the capital. Decisions made in the city could be felt on distant shores through trade alone. Banks learned to support this reality. They issued loans for ships and cargo. They financed warehouses and storage facilities. They calculated interest based on routes and risks. Insurance companies followed the same principles. They looked at storms, piracy, and distance, turning uncertainty into policy. Without these financial tools, the Atlantic system would have struggled to grow. With them, it expanded at a pace that surprised even those who helped build it. The docks along the Thames reflected this transformation. Ships arrived from the Caribbean carrying cargo still scented with salt and wind. Vessels from North America entered the river with tobacco and timber. Outbound ships moved in the opposite direction, carrying British goods back across the sea. Warehouses filled and emptied in steady rhythm. Workers moved crates, barrels, and bundles with practiced speed. The river became a lifeline, connecting London not only to its coastline but to an entire world beyond. As the Atlantic system expanded, the idea of control became more important. London did not simply react to trade. It planned for it. It regulated ports, taxed imports, and negotiated commercial treaties. Diplomats supported merchant interests. Naval patrols protected ships on major sea lanes. Trade policy became part of government strategy. To manage it meant to manage influence. By the 1740s, London had grown into a place where global markets could be imagined in a single room. Maps on walls showed the trade routes that linked continents. Ledgers tracked profits across months and years. Goods moved across the ocean, but decisions moved across the city's desks. A merchant might never leave London and still control a ship halfway around the world. This was the beginning of a new kind of power, one built not on territory alone, but on information, coordination, and financial reach. The Atlantic world also required constant communication. Letters crossed seas alongside cargo. They carried instructions, updates, and negotiations. Although messages moved slowly, they created a sense of connection across distances that once felt unreachable. London's merchants learned patience, but they also learned foresight. They had to prepare for conditions before news reached them. The Atlantic system demanded strategy as much as investment. By 1760, London had changed. It was no longer just a city. It was a command post. A place where merchants, bankers, shipowners, and policymakers shaped decisions that echoed across the ocean. Goods arriving at the docks represented profit, but they also represented influence. The city was learning that the world could be organized through contracts as effectively as through force. It could be shaped by shipping routes, financial networks, and commercial ambition. The Atlantic world emerged through ships, trade, and investment. But it also emerged through the realization that a single capital could coordinate it all. London became the mind at the center of a system stretching across oceans. It became a place where wealth concentrated, where decisions were made, and where the future of trade was imagined. The Atlantic world was not just on the water. It was inside the city, recorded on paper and planned in conversation. Between 1700 and 1760, London discovered its power. Not through conquest alone, but through commerce. Not through possession, but through connection. And in that discovery, the world began to move to a rhythm set far from the shorelines where the waves first touched land. Victory and Expansion 1756 to 1763. The year 1756 marked the beginning of a conflict that would reshape continents. The 7 Years' War spread across Europe, North America, the Caribbean, and Asia. It was a war of armies and navies, of fortresses and supply lines, of diplomacy and distance. Britain entered the struggle determined to challenge the power of France. The outcome would decide not only borders, but the future of an empire. On the fields of Europe, regiments marched in formation while cannon fire echoed across hills. At sea, fleets pursued one another through Atlantic waters as sails strained against the wind. In North America, the war took the shape of fort sieges and contested territories. The frontier, with its forests and rivers, became a stage for a global rivalry. Every victory or setback in one region influenced decisions made in another. By 1759, often called the Year of Victories, momentum shifted toward Britain. Ships captured coastal strongholds, and armies advanced into contested lands. Across the Atlantic, Quebec fell after a hard campaign, opening the path to control of Canada. In the Caribbean, British forces seized valuable islands. These territories were more than points on a map. They were sources of sugar, timber, trade, and influence. They were sources of sugar, timber, trade, and influence. In India, the conflict played out in negotiations, alliances, and battles for control of trade centers. The East India Company, already established in key ports, took advantage of shifting power. British influence expanded along coastal cities and networks of commerce. Even though the war was global, the consequences in India were profound. They laid the foundations for a new era of authority. When the conflict ended in 1763, Britain emerged among the victors. The Treaty of Paris confirmed new borders. Canada was transferred from France to Britain. Territories in the Caribbean strengthened commercial power. Influence in India grew through both military and administrative means. London celebrated these gains with pride. The empire appeared more secure and more powerful than ever before. Yet celebration carried shadows. Victory brought responsibility. Lands newly gained required soldiers, governors, and infrastructure. Forts needed to be repaired. Trade routes had to be guarded. Settlers and merchants needed administration and defense. For every acre added to the empire, the cost of maintaining it increased. Victory had expanded not only territory, but obligation. The British treasury felt the strain immediately. The war had been expensive. Supply contracts, naval construction, and military campaigns drained reserves. Now, with new colonies to manage, the financial burden grew heavier. The empire had expanded quickly, but the question of how to sustain it lingered over parliament and commercial offices. Officials looked to the colonies themselves for answers. North America had vast lands and a growing population. India held commercial value through trade and taxation. The Caribbean produced profitable crops. Many in London believed that the colonies should contribute to the maintenance of the empire. The idea spread that territories gained through victory could also help pay the cost of that victory. For colonists in North America, this shift would soon become a source of tension. Taxes and regulations were introduced to recover war expenses. New policies altered trade and customs. The seeds of future conflict were planted quietly, not on a battlefield but in ledgers and legal documents. Across the empire, the map had changed. The balance of power had shifted. Britain held territories from Canada to the Caribbean, along sea routes that reached toward India. It had achieved what leaders had long sought, a network of influence that stretched across oceans. But the victory that created this network also created the challenge of maintaining it. In London, the monuments and parades symbolized triumph. In offices and counting houses, the reality of cost overtook celebration. The empire had grown too large to be supported without new systems of revenue. Decisions made in the aftermath of the war would slowly lead to debates about rights, representation, and responsibility. In the Caribbean, plantations expanded under British administration while shipping lanes filled with vessels bound for European ports. In Canada, new agreements had to be reached with local populations, settlers, and administrators. In India, trade companies continued to maneuver for authority, positioning themselves to benefit from the shifting landscape of power. By 1763, the empire stood taller than ever before. But the ground beneath it was less stable than it appeared. Debt lingered, policies tightened, and expectations rose. The war had given Britain the world it desired, but not the tools to maintain it without cost. The 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763 was a turning point. It marked the beginning of global expansion on an unprecedented scale. It granted victories that reshaped the future. But victory did not solve the question of sustainability. It only postponed it. London celebrated. But the colonies would help pay for the celebration. An empire is expensive to run. And the bill had arrived. India becomes central in the second half of the 18th century. The year is 1757, and the Battle of Plassey becomes a turning point that shifts power, wealth, and influence across continents. The East India Company gains control in Bengal, and this moment reshapes the future of empire. From this point onward, India is no longer a distant trading partner. It becomes the financial engine that powers administration, expansion, and ambition. In Bengal, new systems of revenue collection take shape. Land taxes, commercial duties, and trade profits begin to flow toward company offices rather than local authorities. The wealth generated in Indian provinces travels across the Bay of Bengal, through Calcutta's docks, and onward to London. Ships carry coin, textiles, raw materials, and valuable goods into imperial markets. The connection grows stronger each year, turning commercial presence into political influence. Company officers stationed in India accumulate fortunes that would have been unthinkable in Britain alone. After years of service, many return home with wealth gained from trade contracts, administrative roles, and financial agreements. Their money fills estates, funds country houses, and enters banks and financial institutions in London. The streets of the capital begin to reflect the wealth of distant provinces. British investors purchase property, open businesses, and expand commercial ventures using wealth tied to Indian revenue. Textiles from Bengal and other regions flood British markets. Cotton, muslin, and silk arrive in bolts of cloth, prized for their quality and craftsmanship. Shops in London sell fine Indian fabrics to customers who admire the brightness of the dyes and the precision of the weaving. These goods travel across Britain, entering markets in Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool. They influence industry, style, and trade patterns in the growing industrial age. At the same time, the company's growing authority requires administration, armies, and infrastructure. Trading posts become administrative centers, and garrisons expand to secure trade routes. To maintain these networks, the company uses Indian revenue. Salaries, supply chains, and military costs are paid from the land they control. India becomes more than a source of goods. It becomes the backbone that funds the machinery of empire. Calcutta emerges as a center of company rule. Streets fill with clerks, traders, and officials. Ledgers record transactions that shape the future of regions thousands of miles away. Local economies adjust to the demands of export. Farmers grow crops for company contracts. Artisans tailor production to overseas buyers. Ports become increasingly crowded with merchant vessels. Each one part of a growing system of exchange. In London, institutions that once oversaw domestic trade take on new global responsibilities. Banks handle accounts linked to Indian revenue. Shipping firms manage cargo routes through the Indian Ocean. The British government begins to take a deeper interest in company operations, recognizing that its fortunes are now tied to distant territories. India's importance is no longer merely commercial. It becomes strategic. It becomes essential. Between 1760 and 1780, influence expands web-like across regions. Treaties, alliances, and negotiations shape territory. Company officials negotiate with rulers, administrators, and nobles. Agreements open doors for trade, but they also create political footholds. The Compania's authority grows, not always through confrontation, but often through paperwork, negotiation, and contracts written in ink. Control spreads boardroom by boardroom, ledger by ledger. Yet behind the growth lies a constant pressure to maintain revenue. Costs rise as administrative responsibilities expand. Armies stationed to secure territories require steady funding. Trade networks rely on safe routes and protection at sea. The company becomes dependent on the flow of money from India. Without it, salaries would go unpaid. Armies would weaken. Influence would fade. Decisions in India shape decisions in Britain, and decisions in Britain reshape the lives of people in India. By the 1780s, British society begins to feel the effects of this connection. Investors seek shares in ventures linked to Indian trade. Newspapers discuss events in Asia as matters of national interest. Parliament debates the future of the company and its territories. Regulations and oversight expand as the British state recognizes the scale of what the company now controls. India becomes central not just to commerce, but to the identity of empire itself. Indian goods influence British manufacturing. Textile mills, soon to be driven by industrial machinery, depend on cotton supplied through networks that connect fields in India to looms in Lancashire. Markets in the empire are shaped by decisions made on both sides of the world. India provides the material. Britain builds the industry. Together, they form an economic cycle that feeds growth across the late 18th century. By 1800, the transformation is complete. India's role in the empire is no longer a possibility or a theory. It is established. It is visible. It is central. Revenue from Bengal and other territories funds administration, pays soldiers, supports expansion, and stabilizes British finances at home. Officers return to Britain with fortunes. Textiles reshape markets. Trade routes form arteries of wealth that stretch from Indian ports to Londona's financial districts. The empire changes because of India. Its economic structure depends on India. And as the 18th century closes, the world that emerges is shaped by decisions, movements, and exchanges that began in 1757. India becomes central. It becomes the pillar of financial stability. It becomes the place where the future of empire takes form. The industrial age changes everything. 1760 to 1830 begins with the first turn of the flywheel, the first plume of steam rising over a factory roof. Britain entered a period unlike any it had seen before. Fields became workshops. Towns became cities. Rivers became engines of power. What started as local innovation would reshape the world. In Manchester, mills rose along the rivers like fortresses of brick and iron. Rows of spinning machines turned cotton into thread at a speed that would have seemed impossible only a generation earlier. Every wheel, every gear, and every belt in motion signaled a new way of life. The city became a symbol of the industrial future, defined by sound, smoke, and ambition. In Birmingham, workshops evolved into factories. Metalworkers forged tools, engines, and components that supplied the expanding industrial network. Pistons and pipes traveled from the Midlands to the mills of the North. Birmingham became a laboratory of invention, where engineering skill powered the machinery of progress. In Glasgow, shipyards along the Clyde constructed vessels that would carry goods, people, and machinery across oceans. Coal poured into boilers. Iron poured into molds. The industrial age needed ships, and Glasgow built them. But while factories and shipyards defined the visible face of the Industrial Revolution, the financial heart of the transformation beat in London. Capital moved through banks like lifeblood through arteries. Investors funded mills, railways, and manufacturing plants. Insurance companies assessed risks. Merchant houses arranged trade. Decisions made in offices along the Thames shaped the industrial landscape of the entire nation. London docks grew crowded with goods from across the empire. Cotton arrived from India. Until 1807, the Atlantic economy also supplied raw materials that fed the mills, part of a trade network that profited from systems of forced labor overseas. Sugar arrived from plantations. Metals came from mines. Spices traveled in crates that smelled of distant markets. Ships unloaded, reloaded, and returned to sea, keeping trade in constant motion. Inside the banks, men studied ledgers and calculations that represented risks taken thousands of miles away. Factories could not operate without the money that flowed through these buildings. The Empyrea's trade routes supplied materials, and London supplied the capital. Together, they fed the engines that defined the age. Time itself seemed to change. Bells marked work shifts, not harvests. The rhythm of life accelerated with the speed of machines. The consequences reached far beyond the factory gates. Rural workers moved into cities, searching for wages and opportunity. Streets filled with the voices of people who had left farms behind. Neighborhoods expanded quickly, sometimes faster than sanitation or housing could keep up. The growth created prosperity and hardship side by side. Innovation came with cost. Air filled with smoke. Rivers carried dyes and waste. Machines transformed landscapes as quickly as they transformed economies. This was progress measured not only in inventions, but in the strain placed upon those who kept the machinery running. Still, the momentum continued. Inventors refined engine designs. Engineers experimented with rail and canal transport. Steam power promised mobility as well as manufacturing. Goods could now travel farther and faster than ever before. London, already a center of finance, became a hub of global exchange, a place where ships arrived daily with cargoes that spoke of the world beyond the horizon. By the early 1800s, the industrial economy reached across continents. Cotton from India entered mills in Manchester. Manufactured cloth returned overseas as exports. Sugar from the Caribbean passed through refineries before appearing on tables in British dining rooms. Commodity chains tied together farms, plantations, ports, and factories in ways that connected lives without ever bringing them face to face. The abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in 1807 marked a legal turning point. Yet the effects of the Atlantic economy had already been built into the foundations of British wealth. Mills, banks, and commercial institutions continued to grow, supported by systems established long before reform reached them. History had momentum, and momentum did not stop with the stroke of a pen. Inside the factories, the future continued to arrive one invention at a time. Textile machines increased output. Steam engines grew more efficient. Ironworks expanded their capacity. Britain became the workshop of the world, its products found in markets across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Londona's financial district reflected this confidence. New counting houses, offices, and exchanges stood like monuments to commerce. Money moved in invisible currents through contracts, credit, and speculation. Wealth accumulated in forms not measured by land or titles, but by investment and industry. By 1830, the Industrial Revolution had reshaped the British landscape. Cities were larger. Trade routes were busier. Technology had woven itself into daily life. The Imperial's resources supported the machinery of change, and the machinery of change reinforced Britannia's influence across the globe. The Industrial Age did not simply build factories. It built systems. It built expectations. It built a world where steam and steel defined possibility. It changed where people lived, how they worked, and what they imagined for the future. It changed the meaning of wealth, labor, and power. Factories rose in Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow. Banks in London made them possible. Cotton, sugar, metals, and global trade fed their engines. Ships carried their products out into the world. The Industrial Age changed everything. And the world has been moving in its shadow ever since. London, capital of an empire 1837 to 1901. Streets stretch outward. Smoke from factories rolls across the skyline, and the River Thames carries ships from every corner of the globe. The city becomes more than a home for royalty and government. It becomes the command center of an empire that reaches across continents. Government offices take on new authority. Behind doors along Whitehall and Downing Street, clerks, ministers, and secretaries write policies that shape lives far beyond Britannia's shores. The Colonial Office oversees territories in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. The India Office directs administration in South Asia, its decisions echoing across millions of lives. Maps hang on walls like blueprints, and each red border marks a place under British rule. This is not rule by accident. It is rule by paperwork, planning, and command. As these offices grow, London becomes the brain of the empire. Decisions made in quiet rooms travel outward, carried by ink, paper, and later, electric signals. Telegraph lines stretch across oceans. Messages that once took months to reach distant lands can now arrive in minutes. Orders no longer wait for winds or tides. They move faster than the ships that once delivered them. A single message can change policy, redirect troops, or alter trade in a heartbeat. Technology becomes a tool of authority, and Londona's voice grows louder with every new cable laid through the sea. The India Office stands as one of the most significant engines of administration. It manages taxation, infrastructure, trade policy, and diplomatic communication with princely states. Reports arrive daily, filling ledgers with numbers, conditions, and requests. The office acts like a government within a government, maintaining a network of responsibility that connects London to Calcutta, Bombay, and beyond. What happens in these rooms shapes the future of South Asia throughout the Victorian era. Nearby, the Colonial Office performs a similar role with a wider range. Governors, envoys, and officials send back reports from territories where roads are being built, trade is expanding, and new laws are being enforced. Agreements are written. Borders are drawn on maps that many of the writers have never walked upon. Londona's influence becomes a force that stretches through geography rather than across it. Outside these buildings, the city continues to grow. Terminals like Euston and Paddington connect the capital to ports and industrial regions. Goods from colonies arrive in crates and barrels. Spices, wool, grain, minerals, and textiles make their way to London warehouses. From those same docks, manufactured goods flow outward, returning to the empire in a cycle that feeds the city's prosperity. London's docks operate like arteries, pumping wealth and resources into the heart of the capital. The Thames becomes a spectacle of global motion. Steamships arrive daily, their holds full of cargo. Sailors and merchants move through the busy districts of Limehouse and Wapping. Barges and tugs crowd the river, handling shipments that carry the scent of forests, oceans, and distant markets. The docks do not rest. They reflect a world connected by trade routes that begin or end in London. Alongside wealth, the city faces strain. Populations rise faster than infrastructure can keep pace. New neighborhoods appear, some elegant, others overcrowded. The Empyrea's prosperity reaches London unevenly, creating distance between luxury and hardship. Inside the Houses of Parliament, debates shape the direction of imperial rule. Laws are drafted to regulate trade, expand infrastructure, and manage distant territories. Every vote, every speech, and every decision sends consequences outward. It is to govern a system that spans seas and continents. Telegraph offices glow with messages at all hours. Operators tap out signals that cross land and ocean cables, connecting London to capitals and outposts across the world. Communication becomes a kind of power. Center and distance blend into one network. The empire no longer feels like a collection of faraway lands. It feels like a structure connected to the capital by invisible wires of information. By the late 19th century, London holds a symbolic weight no other city carries. Museums collect artifacts from abroad. Banks manage international finance. Universities and societies study languages, histories, and sciences connected to the territories under British rule. The city begins to think of itself not only as a capital, but as the headquarters of a world system. From Downing Street to the docks, from the telegraph stations to the committee rooms, the city operates as a command center. It directs, regulates, and communicates. It issues instructions that determine the movement of goods, the administration of laws, and the structure of governance across the empire. The world changes while London watches, instructs, and plans. By 1901, as Queen Victoria's reign comes to a close, London stands at the height of its global influence. It is vast, crowded, powerful, and deeply interconnected with lands that lie far beyond its shores. The future will challenge this system, but in this moment the capital sits at the center of a world that seems to orbit around it. London is not only a city. It is a network, a command post, and a symbol of the age that shaped it. London, capital of an empire. An engine of decisions. A voice carried across oceans. A city where the 19th century was written into the world. In the second half of the 19th century, the British Empire reached its height. Between 1850 and 1914, its borders stretched across continents, its trade routes circled the oceans, and its influence shaped distant societies. But the empire did not feel the same everywhere. Life in London, the imperial capital, developed along lines of wealth, infrastructure, and optimism. Life in many colonies developed under conditions shaped by extraction, regulation, and imbalance. The empire brought prosperity, but not evenly. Its benefits gathered in some places, while its burdens settled in others. In London, the city reflected the confidence of the age. Gas lamps lit the streets, shining on new boulevards that guided nighttime travel. Railways expanded, carrying passengers across the city and linking the capital to port towns and industrial centers. Stations became gateways of movement, symbols of progress and connection. Banks prospered, financing shipping ventures, factories, and international trade. Institutions rose from stone and iron, their architecture proclaiming the growth of wealth and learning. Museums filled with artifacts collected from across the empire. Schools grew in number and prestige. Monuments appeared in public squares, celebrating events and figures that represented imperial achievement. For many residents of the capital, daily life carried an atmosphere of expansion. Shops filled with imported goods from overseas markets. Tea from Asia, sugar from the Caribbean, cotton from India, and preserved foods from Africa entered homes and dining rooms. The Empiria's trade network supplied the rhythms of consumption. Newspapers reported events from distant territories, shaping opinion and curiosity. For those who lived in London, the empire felt like a system that worked. It delivered goods, opportunity, and pride. Even those who struggled economically could see the infrastructure of empire around them. Visible in the bridges, rail lines, and public buildings that marked the city's map. Far away from the capital, the picture looked different. In many colonies, resources were taken to fuel the prosperity of the center. Timber, minerals, crops, and manufactured goods moved outward, following trade paths directed by British interests. Local industries often struggled to compete with imported products from Britain. Regulations favored the goods of the capital, not the regions that supplied it. When factories in London produced cloth, they sold it to markets where handmade textiles had once been an essential part of daily life. Economic systems that had grown locally for generations were pressured into decline or transformation. Infrastructure existed in the colonies, but its purpose was not always local benefit. Railways were built to move resources to ports rather than to connect towns to one another. Roads linked mines or plantations to export centers rather than forming networks for regional travel. Telegraph lines followed administrative routes, designed to send information back to the capital as efficiently as possible. These projects created connection, but the direction of connection flowed outward. In many places, daily life did not improve at the same pace that London's prosperity increased. Laws shaped this imbalance. Administrators and advisors made decisions in offices far from the regions they governed. Trade rules favored British imports. Tariffs supported metropolitan advantage. Local businesses faced restrictions that protected manufacturers in the capital. Agriculture shifted to serve global demand. Sometimes at the expense of food grown for local consumption. Many communities found themselves tied to the needs of distant markets and distant decision-makers. Social life reflected these shifts. In London, education expanded. Public institutions offered training for administrative and commercial careers. Art galleries and scientific societies organized exhibitions. The city projected confidence in the idea of progress. In the colonies, education systems often centered on practical training, designed to serve administrative goals. Social mobility was shaped by structures beyond local control. Opportunity existed, but it was limited by economic and political frameworks that pointed back to the capital. Even the experience of time felt different. In London, clocks marked railway timetables and business hours. Factories ran on schedules built around industrial precision. Telegraph offices communicated decisions at unprecedented speed. In many colonies, the pace of communication depended on distance and infrastructure that served official routes. Information traveled quickly when it benefited administration but moved slowly when distance stood in the way of everyday needs. London became a city of rapid exchange. The colonies existed in systems where speed was uneven. By the early 20th century, the divide had become clear. The empire had created shared connections, but not shared outcomes. In the colonies, many saw that the same system demanded resources, labor, and compliance. The empire could bring railways, ports, and telegraphs, but these developments were often designed to support extraction rather than independence. Yet life in the colonies was not without resilience or identity. Communities adapted to change. Markets formed to meet new conditions. Writers, merchants, and thinkers debated the future. The experience of imbalance created questions that would grow stronger as the 20th century advanced. If wealth could travel thousands of miles to fill banks in London, could opportunity not travel in the other direction? If infrastructure could be built to carry goods to ports, could it not be built to support local growth? These were questions that would shape the world that followed. In 1914, as the empire approached a moment of global crisis, the contrast remained visible. London stood as a capital of power, filled with the symbols of industrial confidence. Many colonies stood as sources of supply, structured around the needs of the center. The empire was held together by trade, administration, and communication, but the weight of benefit did not rest evenly. Some lived in the glow of gas lamps. Others lived in the shadow of extraction. Between 1850 and 1914, life in the capital and life in the colonies belonged to the same system, but the experience of that system was not the same. The empire brought wealth, but not evenly. The benefits and burdens were not shared in equal measure. The capital prospered while many regions carried the cost. And the legacy of that imbalance would shape the decades that followed, as the world began to question who the empire truly served and what price its structure demanded. World Wars and a Changing Relationship 1914 to 1945. In 1914, the world entered an era of destruction and uncertainty. The First World War erupted across Europe with a force that few leaders had expected. London, facing a conflict larger than anything in recent memory, turned outward toward the empire. The colonies had long been part of Britannia's identity and trade network, but now they became essential to survival. The empire was no longer just a symbol. It became a supply chain. India provided soldiers, food, medical workers, and financial contributions that supported campaigns on multiple fronts. Troops left home to fight in distant lands. Supplies crossed oceans, heading for trenches in Europe and deserts in the Middle East. The scale of India's assistance was immense, and it reshaped expectations on both sides. Across Africa, agriculture and industry were redirected for war. Laborers built roads, railways, and military infrastructure. Materials like metals, rubber, and timber traveled to British factories. In the Caribbean, docks loaded sugar, fruit, and raw materials that would feed sailors and citizens alike. Every territory contributed in its own way, drawn into a conflict that was not of their making. Meanwhile, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand fought beside Britain with determination. Their soldiers joined campaigns in Europe, North Africa, and the seas in between. For them, the war was both a duty and a demonstration of their connection to Britain. But the experience also clarified something deeper. They were willing to fight alongside the empire, but they no longer wished to stand behind it. Their participation planted the seeds of expectation. Respect. Recognition. Greater political autonomy. When the First World War ended in 1918, relief spread across the empire. But exhaustion and questions followed. The victory had come at an enormous price. Newspapers celebrated triumph, but beneath the headlines lay a new reality. The relationship between London and the colonies was no longer the same. Demands for independence and reform grew louder. In Africa and the Caribbean, conversations about rights and representation gained momentum. In Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, political identity sharpened. The empire had asked for loyalty during the war. Now its territories asked for a new kind of partnership in return. London could not ignore the shift. The world was changing. The structure of empire had begun to weaken, not from defeat, but from pressure. Pressure from expectations, economic strain, and growing political confidence outside Britannia's borders. The ties that held the empire together were still present, but no longer secure. Then came 1939, and with it a second global conflict. World War II pulled the empire back into crisis. Once again, London turned outward. Once again, the colonies answered. Troops from India fought in North Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. African regiments served in campaigns from Abyssinia to Burma. Caribbean workers joined merchant fleets and industrial labor forces. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand mobilized their militaries with speed and commitment. But this time, the stakes were different. Japan advanced across Asia. British colonies fell. The fortress city of Singapore collapsed in 1942, shaking confidence across the empire. The illusion of permanent control was broken. Britain survived the war, but it emerged weakened. Cities were damaged. Trade was disrupted. The treasury strained under the weight of debt. Victory had come, but it had cost too much. As the conflict ended in 1945, the world was no longer the world that had existed in 1914. Britain stood victorious. But not unchanged. Its military reputation endured. But its financial power had been reduced. The empire that once commanded the oceans now struggled to maintain the responsibilities it had accumulated over centuries. Across the colonies, the war had accelerated political transformation. Expectations of independence rose. Movement strengthened. They saw it as limitation. The old structures could not contain the new ambitions. Britain faced a choice. Continue to hold the empire with resources it did not have. Or acknowledge the changing world and begin a transition. The world after 1945 was defined not by how much land a nation controlled, but by how it adapted to new realities. Power shifted from empires to nations. Influence shifted from territory to diplomacy. The age of unquestioned imperial authority was ending. The relationship between Britain and its colonies had begun as trade. It became administration. It became a negotiation. A balance of needs, expectations, and responsibilities. The world wars did not dissolve the empire overnight, but they guaranteed that it could never return to what it had been. The wars changed borders, politics, and economics. But more than that, they changed perspectives. They revealed that loyalty demanded recognition. They proved that strength required cooperation. They showed that even victory carries consequences. By the end of 1945, London still held an empire on maps. But the map no longer told the whole story. The colonies were no longer simply territories. They were nations in waiting. And the empire that survived the wars would not survive the peace unchanged. The end of empire begins in 1947. After centuries of expansion, control, and global influence, the British Empire reaches a moment that changes everything. India gains independence. And the world watches as the map is redrawn. This is not just the end of a chapter. It is the beginning of an unraveling. The structure that once held continents together under British rule starts to loosen. Piece by piece, territory by territory. Britain emerges from the Second World War victorious, but exhausted. Cities are rebuilding. The economy is strained. Debt hangs over the treasury. The empire that once funded military strength and commercial confidence now demands more than it returns. Across the globe, people who lived under imperial rule see a moment for change. Voices that once went unheard begin to rise. Nations speak of sovereignty, representation, and the right to determine their own futures. In the 1950s, independence movements grow into reality. Ghana becomes self-governing in 1957. Nigeria follows in 1960. Malaya steps forward. Cyprus follows suit. Trinidad and Tobago steps forward. Each independence is unique, shaped by politics, negotiation, or pressure. But together they form a pattern. The empire does not collapse at once. It releases its territories in a controlled but irreversible sequence. Every year the list grows longer. The 1960s become a decade defined by transition. Kenya, Uganda, Jamaica, and many others leave the imperial structure and step into nationhood. British rule contracts instead of expands. Administrators return home. Military bases close. Flags come down and new flags rise. London remains a center of finance and diplomacy, but it no longer commands distant territories with unquestioned authority. As the empire fades, a new vision forms. Instead of rule, Britain seeks partnership. Instead of direct control, it looks toward cooperation. Former colonies become part of an international community known as the Commonwealth. Trade continues, but it no longer flows through imperial frameworks. Migration reshapes British cities, bringing new communities, cultures, and histories to places like London, Birmingham, and Manchester. The end of empire changes Britain itself. The story moves inward as the world moves outward. Through the 1970s and 1980s, the process continues. Some territories remain under British administration, but their number dwindles. Global politics shift. Diplomacy replaces enforcement. Trade agreements replace monopolies. Soft power replaces imperial command. London evolves into a city defined not by control but by connection. Banks manage global finance. Businesses operate across borders. Universities attract students from around the world. The capital becomes international not because it rules the world, but because the world comes to it. It carries its history in architecture and archives. But the meaning of that history changes. It stands as a crossroads of the modern world. Then comes 1997. The return of Hong Kong to China marks the symbolic close of the imperial era. The transfer is conducted through ceremony, diplomacy, and negotiation, not force. It represents a final moment in a long process of withdrawal. From 1947 to 1997, the empire does not fall with a single blow. It recedes like a tide, each wave marking the end of a chapter. When Hong Kong is handed over, the message becomes clear. The empire is no longer the system shaping global power. After 200 years of expansion and 100 years of pressure, the age of empire ends. Britain stands not as the ruler of a global network, but as one nation among many. It still carries influence. It still holds a seat on international councils. But these roles are earned through policy and cooperation rather than inherited from conquest. The world that emerges is more complex than the world that came before. Independent nations determine their own direction. Britain adapts to a new identity shaped by negotiation, history, and memory. Within the United Kingdom, the end of empire forces reflection. Museums, archives, and public debates explore the legacy left behind. Streets and statues reveal how deeply the imperial past is woven into everyday life. The economy shifts to new industries and global markets. The workforce changes. The culture diversifies. Britain learns to define itself not by what it controls, but by what it contributes. For former colonies, independence brings opportunity and challenge. New governments build institutions. New economies rise or struggle. New identities form against the backdrop of long histories of rule. The legacy of empire is complicated, marked by both progress and difficulty, by both connection and division. But independence gives each nation the ability to shape its own narrative. By the end of the 20th century, the British Empire exists only in history books, documentaries, and the architecture of old government buildings. The world has moved forward. The empire that once stretched across oceans becomes a memory of a different age. The end of empire is not a single moment. It is a half-century of transition. It begins with independence in 1947. It ends with Hong Kong in 1997. A system once built on control becomes a system built on connection. The legacy today begins in a city where history and the present walk side by side. London stands without an empire, but not without the traces of the world that empire once shaped. Streets lined with banks, museums, courts, and docks tell a story that reaches far beyond Britannia's shores. The political power is gone, yet the influence remains in language, law, and the paths people travel. Even without empire, the connection endures. English is spoken in classrooms from West Africa to South Asia. Legal systems modeled on Westminster guide courts across continents. Railways built under colonial administration still carry passengers through landscapes transformed by time. Borders drawn in distant offices became the outlines of nations. Trade routes once enforced through power now operate through agreement, shipping lanes still tracing old patterns across the sea. These connections are not echoes of command. They are threads of history that never fully broke. They exist in textbooks, treaties, and economic partnerships. They live in airports and seaports, in banknotes and documents, in the shared language of negotiation and exchange. The empire ended. The relationships continued. Migration reshaped London, not through conquest but through community. Ships, planes, and promises brought families from India, Pakistan, Nigeria, Ghana, the Caribbean, Hong Kong, and beyond. Workers helped rebuild after war. Students arrived seeking opportunity. Doctors, shopkeepers, tailors, engineers, teachers, and artists became part of the city's rhythm. Their voices filled markets and train stations. Their food, music, and traditions changed the streets. London is no longer a capital of empire. It is a crossroads of worlds. Walk through its neighborhoods and the legacy appears in everyday life. South Asian restaurants beside Victorian terraces. Caribbean markets near old docksides. African churches in buildings once meant for merchants and offices. A global city shaped by people whose ancestors once lived under a flag that no longer flies above them. The transformation is not simple nostalgia or celebration. It is the result of history converging with the present. Some arrived by choice. Others by circumstance. Their presence is woven into Britannia's identity. Not an inheritance of empire, but a redefinition of what it means to belong. Museums hold artifacts that traveled across oceans. Some arrived through trade. Others were taken during conquest. Their glass cases reflect unresolved questions. They stand as reminders that history is not only about pride but also responsibility. These objects speak quietly. They challenge visitors to consider who once owned them and what it means for them to be here. In former colonies, the legacy is visible too. Courtrooms with familiar architecture. Universities that began as imperial institutions, now shaping national futures. Rail lines still running along the original tracks. Presidents and prime ministers delivering speeches in a language learned through history, now used to assert independence instead of compliance. Trade deals replace tax systems. Visas replace orders. Diplomacy replaces command. others with caution. Some nations look to Britain with cooperation. Many with both. The influence is subtle, but still felt. London's financial districts trade currencies with countries once inside the empire. Students from Commonwealth nations fill university lecture halls. Cultural festivals celebrate traditions that grew continents away. Football stadiums cheer for players whose families began their stories elsewhere. No empire controls these movements. But without empire, they might never have begun. The legacy is not uniform. It is not entirely positive or negative. It is layered and complex. It exists in opportunity gained and opportunity denied. In stories of success and stories still unfinished. In pride and in memory. In places where the past feels heavy. And in places where it feels like guidance. A person walking through London may never notice it consciously. But the signs are everywhere. Street names tied to merchants and voyages. Statues overlooking rivers that once carried imperial cargo. Government buildings designed for an age of administration. Public squares that hosted parades for victories now distant. The architecture holds on to history even as daily life moves forward. A person walking through London may never notice it consciously, but the signs are everywhere. Street names tied to merchants and voyages. Statues overlooking rivers that once carried imperial cargo. Government buildings designed for an age of administration. Public squares that hosted parades for victories now distant. The architecture holds on to history even as daily life moves forward. A person walking through London may never notice it consciously, but the signs are everywhere. Street names tied to merchants and voyages. Statues overlooking rivers that once carried imperial cargo. Government buildings designed for an age of administration. Public squares that hosted parades for victories now distant. The architecture holds on to history even as daily life moves forward. A person walking through London may never notice it consciously, but the signs are everywhere. Street names tied to merchants and voyages. Statues overlooking rivers that once carried imperial cargo. Government buildings designed for an age of administration. Public squares that hosted parades for victories now distant. The architecture holds on to history even as daily life moves forward. A person walking through London may never notice it consciously, but the signs are everywhere. Street names tied to merchants and voyages. Statues overlooking rivers that once carried imperial cargo. Government buildings designed for an age of administration. Public squares that hosted parades for victories now distant. The architecture holds on to history even as daily life moves forward. A person walking through London may never notice it consciously, but the signs are everywhere. Street names tied to merchants and voyages. Statues overlooking rivers that once carried imperial cargo. Government buildings designed for an age of administration. Public squares that hosted parades for victories now distant. The architecture holds on to history even as daily life moves forward. A person walking through London may never notice it consciously, but the signs are everywhere. Street names tied to merchants and voyages. Statues overlooking rivers that once carried imperial cargo. Government buildings designed for an age of administration. Public squares that hosted parades for victories now distant. The architecture holds on to history even as daily life moves forward. A person walking through London may never notice it consciously, but the signs are everywhere. Street names tied to merchants and voyages. Statues overlooking rivers that once carried imperial cargo. Government buildings designed for an age of administration. Public squares that hosted parades for victories now distant. In the Caribbean, the legacy rises in music and language. In South Asia, it appears in railway networks and parliamentary debates. In East and West Africa, it can be heard in legal terms and educational systems. These are not chains. They are imprints. They can be changed, challenged, or rewritten. But first they must be recognized. The empire ended. The relationships continued. London and the former colonies shaped each other. The movement of goods, laws, and languages was not one direction alone. Cultures blended. Ideas traveled. People carried more than cargo. They carried identity. Today's Britain is not the Britain of 1900. Today's India, Nigeria, Jamaica, Malaysia, Kenya, and Bangladesh are not what empire imagined they would be. They are independent voices, speaking back to history instead of being spoken for. The legacy lives on, not as a throne or a command, but as a connection. A reminder that the world we know did not emerge in isolation. It was built through centuries of contact, conflict, cooperation, and change. In every port where global ships arrive. In every memory passed down through families. In every neighborhood where worlds meet. The empire ended. The influence remains. And every city, every nation, every person touched by that history continues to shape what the legacy becomes next. Thank you for listening and exploring the consequences of power has consequences and connections last longer than empires last longer than empires have consequences and connections last longer than empires last longer than empires have consequences and connections last longer than empires last longer than empires have consequences and connections last longer than empires last longer than empires